Hey there, everybody. This is Jay Frost speaking to you live from Yokohama. And I'm really glad that you could take a few minutes to join us today for a conversation about Asian Americans in philanthropy and fundraising. This is, of course, AAPI Heritage Month, and there are a lot of months for a lot of things, and all of them really deserve some celebration. We try to do that as much as we can in the Philanthropy Mastermind series. This one has special meaning for me, and I hope it does for you, in part because there is so much impact and meaning here, but we, from my perspective, rarely talk about it. And so we're going to have a chance to talk with three folks who are leaders in this sector, just to talk as they wish to talk about their own careers and work, and we'll see where that conversation leads. It's also a chance for those who are here with us live to participate in that conversation. So we want to encourage that. You can do that through the chat. In fact, if you feel like warming that up right now, we would love that. So just go ahead and say hello, or whatever you want to say. You can say konnichiwa or ohayo gozaimasu because it's 5:30 in the morning here, so I would appreciate that. And hello from LA, Michelle. Really good to see you. Thank you for starting the chain there. And Jared, hi there from DC. That's my usual location. Good to see you joining us. And of course, Jeff is right here on the panel. You're going to meet him in just a moment. What I'm going to do is, in addition to encouraging you, and Charles, thank you, and everybody else, and Jane, hey, glad you can make it. In addition to using the chat, is to think about if you want to participate in this conversation more actively. In other words, you have a story to tell. I don't want you to feel silenced by the mechanism of Zoom. So we can occasionally bring people up onto the stage if you really want to participate by sharing your own story. And to do that, the best way is to contact us through the chat to the host and panelists and let us know so we can find an appropriate time to bring you in. But other than that, use the chat and the Q&A to engage in the conversation from a distance, or even anonymously if you prefer. It's totally up to you. This is a safe space. And it's that way because of our sponsors. So I want to give a shout out to the people at DonorSearch. And of course, we won't be talking about them here unless any of the panelists decide to mention them for some reason. And that's simply because this is not about the work that they do, although it's terrific work. You can check it out at DonorSearch.net. But mainly because they provide a platform for conversations like this one that we're having today. And they've been doing that since 2016. So they're well over now 550 of these sessions. And you can see many of them recorded over on their YouTube channel, but also on the DonorSearch site at DonorSearch.net under the resources tab. Now, enough of that. I want to jump right in. And in fact, before I do the introductions to three very patient people here who are in a very, very different time zone, I want to give a little context for this discussion and why in the world I'm hosting it. I know that I host this series, but this is also a special thing, and in ways that you can't tell by looking at my face, which goes to the heart of the conversation about how the diversity we hold and the things we care about aren't always visible. So in my own, and this is the only thing I'll say on the personal front, and then I'm going to make sure we have a chance to listen to the real stars here. Since 1989, particularly, but also since 1985 professionally, I've been engaged in conversations involving especially Asian philanthropy, both within the United States, but also broadly around the world. It's an exciting topic, but interest in it kind of waxes and wanes. And it's very interesting to me because when you think about it, let's just think about the numbers for a moment. We have over, I think it's 60% of the world's population residing in Asia. Asia is also described, sometimes for convenience's sake in the United States, as monolithic. Well, we're talking about in Asia, again, 48 countries, 3 territories. So lots of people, hundreds upon hundreds of languages, no single religious background or philosophical background. There are many, from Confucianism to Taoism, and right here in Japan, Shintoism, to the degree that that's practiced. And the reason I'm mentioning all this is because that diversity then is reflected in our own country, in the United States, if you're watching from there, where you see lots of different people whose backgrounds may influence some of their thinking and definitely their familial heritage, from anything from maybe what they've eaten at home growing up to maybe the things they think about in the office. And so I wanted to contextualize that because if we tend to group things together, sometimes, again, for convenience, we want to make sure we don't do it in a way that overly generalizes, so we lose both the nuance and the importance of all the communities that make up this great fabric of philanthropy and fundraising in the United States. So a couple more quick stats and then I'll be quiet. Another one is that we've got, what is it, in the United States? This is from a study that was just done by Pew Research Center by Carolyn M. and Abby Buneman, just came out a few days ago. Check that study out. I'm going to see if we can link it in the chat and then include that in the show notes. But 64% of Asian American adults say they've given to a U.S. charity in the last 12 months. The conversation in the United States over the last year, 2 years, has really been about a generosity crisis. And it's a really important conversation to have about the decline in giving. That has not happened in this community. If anything, it's a countervailing force that's lifting philanthropy. So it's probably the largest by ethnicity race, however you just choose to define that, within the American context of philanthropy. 20% have given to a charity located in a country of origin or a country of familial origin, a distinction that's important because when it comes to Asian Americans, again, from many places, you're looking at a population that's majority immigrant. So it's really fascinating when you think about it from that context. So lots of people who've been in the United States for generation upon generation, and other people who just got here last week. And all those people have a different experience that's important to honor. But I think most importantly for all of us within the American fabric of philanthropy, to have a keen interest in, because we have lots to learn and lots to share. Another thing that's kind of an interesting facet of this is remittances. We won't talk about that probably much today, but there's $63 billion with a B in remittances coming from the Asian American community to around the world, especially the Philippines, China, Vietnam, India, South Korea, and Japan. It's really a startling number because this isn't all from people who just moved here in the last year. These are from families that are still connected to families and causes around the world. But here's the thing that's kind of shocking and interesting. When you look at professional philanthropy in the United States, there are a couple of things that are quite different. First of all, only 1% of corporate giving and 0.2% of foundation giving are going to this community. And I guess the question is why? I'm not sure we're going to answer that today, but it's an interesting thing for us to be thinking about. And then finally, we've got among fundraisers very little data to know how many people do we have here and how many are working in the sector. So the three people you're going to have an opportunity to hear from directly, and maybe a couple of others in the course of the conversation today, are just reflecting their own personal experience, and a lot of it that they have. So we're really lucky to have it. But it is three voices. And I'm stressing that because unless they say otherwise, and they can say anything they want, I don't think they mean to speak for everybody here, but they definitely are voices that we need to hear. And I would like to suggest to all of us in the profession that we ought to be having a better sense about how broad and impactful this community truly is, because we just don't have the numbers. Zippia says 5.2% of fundraisers are Asian American. You know, again, that broad brush definition. The Chronicle Philanthropy from a study says it's 2%. The AFP doesn't even give us a number. So again, another issue we can't settle, but the main point is lots of impact, relatively modest community, having enormous philanthropic impact. And so with that, finally, I want to introduce first Jennifer Lee Dotson. Jennifer, who has been instrumental in pulling together a few folks here. Jennifer, please say hello.
Aloha, everyone. And Jay, thank you so much for that introduction. Jay, you and I have been friends for a long time, thanks to AFP, thanks to our amazing fundraising community. I also have been very good friends for a long time with Terry, who is an AFP colleague, but we also started up based on this conversation about a year ago, right around the time of AAPI Heritage Month, because of a huge hullabaloo that happened on social media. Maybe some of you remember that, but Terry and I started a virtual API group, affinity group, because of a lot of the challenges we were personally facing as fundraisers of color, Asian fundraisers, and also during this heightened awareness during AAPI Heritage Month, we felt like we needed that collective voice. So thank you so much for bringing this community together so that we can talk about the challenges, but also some of the successes, but also to build our community together, because the support is very important. The data does not show, definitely does not reflect the impact and the collective power that we have as fundraisers of color. And I do see a question from Jane in the Q&A panel. I'd love to for all of us to address that. But by way of introduction, and then I will hand it off to my my colleagues here. You heard me say aloha. I am actually made in Vietnam, and then I was raised in Hawaii. And I left Hawaii for the first time as a young lady going to school in DC. And I remember joining all of the different student clubs at Georgetown University. And I joined the Japanese club because I am Japanese. I joined the Vietnamese club because I'm also Vietnamese. And I joined the Chinese club because I'm Chinese as well. And I remember as I went from club to club to club and joining them, they also had really good food during their sign up period, right? You know, they had desks with food there. And as a student, I was like, oh, this is very, 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 very personally rewarding. They kept asking me, so what are you? So what are you? And I'm like, well, I'm Japanese, but I'm also Chinese and I'm also Vietnamese. And that was, I think, the first time I had been questioned about my ethnicity, because I suppose I look more Chinese than I do Vietnamese, or I look more Chinese than I do Japanese. And you brought up the very important fact that Asia is more normally seen as this monolithic Asian, community, population, but the diaspora of Asian, and especially also being raised in Hawaii, it is something that's always been very top of mind. So I'm looking forward to diving in on this conversation with our colleagues and our friends here that have joined us. But with that, let me please pass it off to my good friend, fellow fundraiser, friend from AFP. We were in Toronto together for AFP Icon, Terry.
Thank you, Jennifer. I love what you said, made in. So I was made in Korea, came over when I was young to LA, and grew up in a very Quaker town with very deep Latino roots. And what was wonderful about that is they celebrated everyone's culture. But I came in when assimilation was like the big push. So, first thing you did is you become as American as you can be. So when I went to college for the first time, it was an eye-opener because there were like 4 or 5 Asians in my high school. But when I went to college, it was like, oh my God, my people were everywhere, or so I thought. So I also joined the Korean American Christian Fellowship group, all these different student groups, and I did not fit in because I didn't go to the big Korean churches, and I didn't call everyone older brother, older sister. I was always the older sister, so it was a shocking cultural difference. But what was nice was it did force me to kind of look at how I position myself. And I was taking a women's studies class, and the professor says, you've got to identify, position yourself. So I realized I'm an immigrant, I'm an Asian American, I'm an Asian, I'm an American, I'm all these things at the same time. And that has kind of inform the way I approach things, especially the immigrant lens. So I'd like to hand it off to Jeff now.
Oh, Jeff, we can't hear you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Terry. Good to hear your perspective, Jennifer. No, my headset's not working.
Oh, I think it's the headset. So while you
Can you
disconnect,
hear me now?
I think so. Yeah, that sounds great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, Terry and Jennifer, good to hear your stories. Thank you, Jay, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Korean as well, but I grew up in
Oh, I think we're
Canada.
having a
So I
little
grew up
internet
in Vancouver
interruption.
Island. Sorry?
I can hear Jeff. I can hear Jeff.
Well, yeah, I grew up in Vancouver. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I grew up in Vancouver, but originally I grew up when we first immigrated to Canada, I grew up on Vancouver Island and on an Indian reservation called the Nuka Indian Reservation in the northwest Pacific part of Vancouver Island, very remote place where there was about 70 people. And then our family immigrated to Vancouver. And of course, I'm 62, so it makes me one of the elder statesmen, if you will. And when I was growing up, there was very few Korean people in Vancouver. And if you wanted to meet them, you had to go to a Korean church, but I didn't attend a Korean church, so I never met them. So I was like counted as Chinese because 1 out of every 3rd person in Vancouver is Chinese, and I can order dim sum in Chinese now. And I've been to plenty of Chinese weddings because a lot of my Canadian friends are Chinese Canadian descent with the Cantonese extract. Now, having said that, growing up as an immigrant kid, I grew up in the worst part of Vancouver. It's a beautiful city, right? And Vancouver is absolutely gorgeous. You got to go in July or August. It's stunning. But every city has its worst neighborhood. And if you've ever listened to Will Ferrell, he tells about the fact that he grew up in Irvine, in ghetto Irvine. And somebody says to him, well, how could Irvine be ghetto? Now, I live in Irvine right now. So how could Irvine be ghetto? Well, it is because he grew up in a single family home in a trailer park in Irvine. So in every city, there is a good or the best areas, and we know about that, and there is the worst areas. And so my mom and dad had both health issues about 5 years after we immigrated. So I grew up in the Raymer City or the Raymer Avenue projects there, which is downtown East Side Vancouver, very poor. And I think we were about the only Korean family in that project. So that's been my experience in growing up. But I stumbled into fundraising and philanthropy in my mid-30s and have not looked back, and have worked now 27 years in it. And under my leadership, I've raised about $240 million with the world's largest NGO, World Vision, I was director of philanthropy for Asia, and now I'm working for a tech hub company, a faith-based tech hub company as a senior vice president for development, leading a group of major gift officers. But I share this because when I first got into this role in funding and fundraising back in '96 or so, I looked for others, and there were very few Asian Americans doing this. First of all, there was nobody in the faith-based sector that was a major gift officer like I was at that time. And there was very few people in the educational sector that were doing fundraising that were Asian Americans. So it's so good to see so many more like Jennifer and Terry and others, and Jay, for you to lead us and facilitate this discussion. This is a long time coming. So thanks so much for letting me share a little bit of my background.
Thank you all for all of that. I'm sorry about our little internet connections there. And Jack, on the back end, I'm sure will let me know if there's an interruption on my signal. I really appreciate the background stories, and it goes to the heart of this thing about the diversity within the community, but also the diversity within our families, which I really love. But we just started touching on this issue about how we got into this particular field. So Jeff, you touched on that. How about for the two of you, for Jennifer, for Terry, why this field?
Jennifer, should I go?
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. Go for
So
it.
I love creating programming during college, and I thought, how can I do this? And I decided I better go. I decided I want to go into nonprofit work, and I was Christian at the time, so I prayed. And I said, Lord, you're gonna take over taking care of my family because I can't financially take care of them. Because of course, as an Asian, you were supposed to be a doctor or an attorney or something, right? An engineer. And so I said, well, that's not going to happen. So I'm going to leave it to you to take care of the family. I'm going to go into nonprofit work. And I got a job in program work and in literacy, and I loved it. And I progressed to a management position, moved to a new organization. But within a few months, I was told that the funding for my staff is going away, which just, I was apoplectic, because how do you, if you know a year in advance that the funding is going to be gone, how do you not fundraise? And I realized, oh my gosh, I better learn how to do this, because you can't start a program, get the community invested, and then not have the program continue. So I worked with the board. I set up a corporate sponsorship program. We raised enough money to hire one full time. And then I decided the next job I'm going to get is going to be in fundraising, because I need to learn this. I can't run away from it. I just have to do it. And I'm good at building programs. So that's what I did. The next job I got was with the community hospital, and I started in my development work there. What I wasn't expecting is to fall in love with fundraising. I love meeting people, seeking out resources, connecting them to wonderful people who are bringing critical programs to the community. And I am so grateful to be in this space. So that's my story.
So my origin story started when I was born. And I mentioned to you that I was made in Vietnam and then raised in Hawaii. The reason why is because my mother, very pregnant, evacuated from the top of the Saigon embassy in a helicopter, went into labor in the airspace above Hawaii. So the airplane had to make an emergency landing, and that's how our family ended up in Honolulu. Now, when we landed, no food, no clothing, no place to live, nothing except the kindness of strangers. And to this day, my family does not know who these people were that helped us. They could have been churches, they could have been nonprofits, they could have been Good Samaritans. And for Tom, you're from Hawaii, good people in Hawaii. We have so much ohana. We have so much where people just pitch in. We don't know to this day. So I was raised, I was a little baby, and my first bassinet was donated to us. Clothing for little baby clothes for baby Jennifer donated to us. People helped my mother and father fill in some applications for places to live. And the only way that our family could give back was not because we had the financial resources to give back and show our thanks. So my mother, my popo, my grandmother, maternal grandmother, would always take me all throughout my childhood to the temple every week so that we could cook food to say thank you for people that helped us. And again, we didn't know who they were, but giving back in this way was taught to me from a very early age. And I never stopped doing that. So when I went into high school and we had a volunteer requirement to graduate from our high school, a lot of the other teenagers were complaining, oh my gosh, why do I have to do that? That is like taking away time from my sports. It's taking away from, being cool and maybe even like going to the beach and hanging out with friends. But I was like, oh, awesome. I already know how to do this. So my very first volunteer position was with the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and I became a summer camp counselor. Fast forward to something that Terry had mentioned. Her parents, just like my parents, had a very strong idea of what they wanted me to do for my occupation. And for my mother, she wanted me to go into the federal government because it was a stable job. It was a very well-paying job. Well, at least to her, right? Well-paying. It was quite good in terms of status. Like she would be able to tell all her friends that her daughter worked for the federal government. And so my first job out of college was with the federal government. And I continued to volunteer. And this was something that with the Muscular Dystrophy Association, I never stopped volunteering for them, to the point where we all know, for those of us who are in the nonprofit sector, if you hang around at a nonprofit long enough, they kind of turn to you and say, well, why don't you just work here? I mean, like, you're always here. Like, why don't you just work here and get paid to do it? And I said, huh, I never thought of that. And that was on a Friday, one day when I was like really disgruntled with my job at the time, which again was a very like high paying status, in my mom's eyes, status, government job. That was on a Friday. And the next Monday, I started my new job at the Muscular Dystrophy Association. My mother just about wanted to faint. And I said, I am going to be the best fundraiser that the Muscular Dystrophy Association has ever seen. And I had never, ever fundraised before, ever. And so that's when I turned to people and I was like, how do you fundraise? How do you do this job? And that's how I found the AFP, Association of Fundraising Professionals, because they put on training, they put on webinars, they have conferences. And I signed up for my first fundraising conference through AFP. So that's how I fell into nonprofit fundraising. And I have to agree with Terry. I love this work. It's hard work, and that's why we need each other. But I absolutely love this work. And I think it does come with challenges. And again, Jane, I see your question in the Q&A. I think we should probably address those very specific challenges because it's hard. And without each other, this fundraising work is hard. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jay, and see if you want to divvy up who answers Jane's question first.
Well, just one thing I have to note first is this thing about parental expectations, which I know is a universal, but I really feel it, and I hear it a lot in my family. But I'm also in a place where this is the home of go and become a government bureaucrat. I mean, at least that's still a little bit true here in Japan. So it's kind of funny. I know our parents have these expectations. Probably none of our parents thought we're going to go into fundraising. That wasn't on their minds. This question from Jane, I think is great. And I don't know if she's here any longer. I know she had little ones to tend to, and she's in yet another time zone. But she's someone who's worked in the sector a long time. And for those who can't read it, she says, could the panelists talk about the challenge of straddling the undesired invisibility that Asian Americans often deal with alongside the seamless orchestrating that we as fundraisers have to pull off? Do you all have thoughts on that? I don't know who would want to take that first. Jeff, do you have any kind of comments on
that? Well, I guess the downside of that is that we're not seen. But during the pandemic, my wife and both my daughters, all three of my female Asian family members of the household were all accosted racially. So they're unseen but seen, and we attribute that to a lot of the stuff that was going on in society with politics and the division that there exists. But if we're going to help people, we also have to understand what are the issues behind where Asian Americans, the dynamics. Like, for example, a lot of the Southeast Asian Americans, Laotian, Cambodian, Vietnamese, perhaps suffer from, they come from more of an oral culture rather than a high academic reading culture. And they're more storytellers. Filipinos are the same, the Malay people. And so sometimes, they fall through the cracks in terms of education and the push in education like the East Asians have. Two, if you think about the seniors in society in Asian American, a lot of them fall behind because they don't have the lack of English language. And so they don't have access to social services and information that is readily available. So I think to answer that question, how do we sustain this? We have to raise our voices and we have to have more representation. We can't just be the passport face. The passport face is a good one because we can flow, and sometimes there's that stereotype that we can flow in the Anglo-American society very well as an honorary white. But there is also this understanding that we have to raise up leaders within our own communities to advocate for Asians and some of the issues like education and the lack of it, and social services among the elderly who lack the English language ability, and therefore we must advocate for them. So I'm hoping I'm answering some of those issues well.
Wow. You said that so beautifully, but you also raised a couple of things that I'm really glad to hear you talking about, although it sounds like it was very traumatic for your family.
Yes.
So I'm sorry to hear. I hope that they're all doing okay after that.
Yeah, my wife was accosted at the Costco parking lot, told to go back home to China. Of course, we're Korean, so they don't know. Two, my older daughter was going to a church service and she was accosted by somebody on the bus. And then third, my youngest daughter was accosted. She was actually slapped so hard that she had 2 black eyes, and her arms had like this person grabbed her, and she was built like a rower, like just a big person, and just told that she wasn't welcome or wanted. And so she had actually PTSD, my youngest daughter, and black eye for 2 weeks.
Oh my gosh. Oh, Jefferson.
All during the pandemic.
Early on in my career, what was interesting, what I kept coming across was being perceived as lacking, because I'm Asian immigrant, that my language ability wasn't up to par. Yeah, so my writings were always rejected. And what the tactic I would use is I would submit my writing under someone else's name, and then it would be accepted and praised. And so, there are crazy things like that. In the middle of my career, when I was serving in the director role and working with boards, the white board members would challenge my desire to talk about fundraising, saying, oh, we don't talk about money. We don't boast about what we raised. No, we don't do that. But you're trying to explain to them, but you have to do that because we're in the business of raising money for this wonderful organization. We shouldn't be afraid to do it. And so it was very interesting to get that, as if you don't realize that that is patently vulgar, in our culture. And I thought, but I grew up in your culture. I grew up here in the United States. This is the way Americans fundraise. This is how we do it. So it's been very interesting to see that progression over time. Lately, though, I'm in my 50s, so I feel a little bit more confident about who I am, and I'm able to bring all of me. The Korean American, the immigrant, the Gen X, all of me into the space where I am. Whereas before I would hide it and I would have a dual identity at work and I would code switch, but I am dropping the code more often lately and just being a little bit more authentic. And I think it's partly because the environment I'm in, people are very open and welcoming. They're lovely. But also I'm older and I have more confidence. And so I'm more comfortable in my own skin. I wasn't expecting that though. I wasn't expecting that.
Terry, I totally agree with you. And Jefferson, I'm so sorry to hear, especially what happened to your younger daughter. The physicality and brutality of that is not okay. And for such a young one to have the PTSD, my heart breaks. And it also brings up the flood of memories and how painful that time was for many of us. I also was accosted several times actually during the time where, well, COVID had first started, and I live in Washington State, which is, and you are in the Pacific Northwest as well. So you understand this. We were ground zero. We were ground zero for the first outbreak cases that came out in the news. And I was walking with my children, and a woman screamed at us, "Go back to China and take your virus with you." Similar to what your wife experienced at Costco, and it was very painful. Now, layer on top of that the question that Jane's asking about being a fundraiser and having that additional stress. You're right, Jefferson. You're right. We're seen and not seen. Most times as Asian fundraisers, not seen until it marks a check box on the list for their DEIA or their Stop Asian Hate social media. So I had a situation, unfortunately, this is in my place of employment as a fundraiser. Several of my friends had mentioned, "Oh, is your organization going to issue a statement about Stop Asian Hate?" Most of our nonprofit organizations had come up with these public statements, and it was a time where you needed to take a stance. You needed to take a stance. I remember at that point, it had been probably about a week and a half after the murder of these 7 Asian women in Atlanta, that my boss turns to me and says, "Oh, I know what we should do. You write the statement for Stop Asian Hate, and then I'll put my name on it and we'll put it on our website." I was flabbergasted. It took me actually quite a while to even know what to even say to my boss about this. I mean, I was like, that doesn't sit well with me. But at the same time, I was like, I also don't want to be fired because you're my boss. So difficult. Okay, Jane, now you bring up another situation that was also quite painful for me. So most of my donor base was in Asia at the time, and COVID had shut down the ability for me to have in-person meetings. I mean, let alone have in-person meetings because we're in Washington and the entire I-5 corridor had shut down, literally had shut down. Buses had shut down, public transportation had shut down, trains had shut down. But borders were now shut down. And so I couldn't reach my my donor base, and I had to pivot. And we had a strategy session with our board of directors. And I kid you not, this is like, you cannot make this stuff up. As fundraisers, we know nothing surprises us anymore when we share these, when we share these fundraising stories. We're in a strategy session, my boss, and the board of directors. And the board chair turns to me and says, I know what we should do. Now we're in Washington, right? We're in Washington. Headquarters to Microsoft. I know what we should do. Jennifer, you're Chinese. You should ask all the Chinese people at Microsoft to donate to us. All right. For all of us that are nonprofit fundraisers and fundraisers, we know that's not how fundraising works, my friends. This is the additional burden that we have to suffer through. Fundraising is hard. And then you're pointing at me and saying, oh, you're a Chinese person. Go ask the rich Chinese people at Microsoft for money. I'm like, wait a minute, that's a little bit of an overgeneralization, by the way. Not everybody that works for Microsoft is Chinese and is rich. Whatever. You get the idea. You get the story. This sucks. And if we don't have each other, it sucks even more, right?
Jennifer, one thing I will say, though, is that, well, everybody's stories kind of prove this, even though these things are things that all people in fundraising should understand. Like you just said, clearly they don't. So while you shouldn't have to make testimony to let all your colleagues understand these things, apparently something like that is required, because otherwise people wouldn't ask you to do these ridiculous, ludicrous, and offensive things. But I mean, someone in the chat had said, something about that we have some of these things obviously not being slapped and accosted, but some of these things, I guess the involuntary reaction among some of us, among myself, is to laugh at the horribleness of it all until we can't laugh anymore. And so it's understandable. I know we have at least one other person with a lot of experience in this area. Can I bring another person into the conversation? And that's Tom Tsang. And so, Tom, I'm going to change your status, and you'll have to just bear with me with my technical deficiencies, but hopefully you will be joining us as a panelist any minute. So for those who don't know Tom's been in the sector for a while. He was over there at Stanford after U of C, Chicago, then at University of Hawaii Foundation, and many places, UCSD, and now, of course, at Exeter. Tom, thank you so much for making some time to hang out and be a part of this pretty amazing conversation.
Konnichiwa, Jay, and I'll be in Tokyo in about a month's time. Can't promise I have free time yet, because I'll be accompanying my headmaster or my principal from Phillips Exeter Academy. But now that I know you're in Japan, I think in Tokyo, am I right?
Yes, but I'll be gone by then. I'll be gone the 23rd.
Okay. Darn.
We'll miss each other again.
We'll miss, yeah, but that's too bad. In any event, thank you for promoting me into a panelist. Happy to join this august group of speakers. And yes, I've been around. I think biologically I'm slightly younger than Jeff, but perhaps a few more years longer in terms of my fundraising career. And then before that, I actually also put in 6 years in college admissions at my alma mater, Cornell University. So pretty much my entire career is in education, most of it in higher ed. This new gig with Exeter is my first foray into independent school fundraising and advancement work. So I've now done private universities, public university, and for the very first time in a boarding school situation. So that's a quick thumbnail of my background. I'm an engineer by training, and in Chinese we have a phrase called 学非所用. I learned a whole bunch of things that I never get to practice or just kind of chuck it away, and that's me.
So you've been sitting in and listening to a lot of this conversation, and you're no stranger, I'm sure, to some of these kinds of stories. I don't know what you've experienced personally, but do you have any comments on some of these things that you've been hearing? And can you share from your personal experience about how it may have been similar or different in your own work?
Yeah, I mean, similar and different. And I started out last century in higher ed and then eventually in advancement. My route is in some ways slightly different from everybody else's, although I think, if you really look under the microscope, you'll find similarities. I joke that I was seduced into it only because when I met my then girlfriend, now wife, some 30 plus years ago, she was a principal gift officer. I was a lowly admission officer. And back in those days, the admission officers, like, youth development people, stay away from us, right? And but lo and behold, as I got to know many of her colleagues, I thought their work was fascinating, right? Talking to people and then get their money, and you get paid for doing that. And then on top of that, you mean you can travel internationally, fly in business class in some instances? Well, sign me up. And so I kind of, stumble into development and advancement, as many of us have, right? I'm an engineer by training, and no Asian parents will put their kids through 4 years of Ivy League school and say, "What? You're going to work for the nonprofit? Are you kidding me?" Right? And then, of course, my very first big assignment was in 1995 for Cornell, and I don't know if everybody on this webinar is old enough to remember what happened in June of 1995, but basically we almost started World War III at Cornell by inviting one of our most famous alumni, President of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui, to visit the United States. And for a month before that, I basically slept 3 hours a day trying to get this visit ready. And so my father, up until the time he died, literally thought maybe I was working for State Department, right? Because that's what we were dealing with, with folks at Foggy Bottom in the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the funny thing is, I grew up in Taiwan, actually aspiring to be a diplomat, not knowing, of course, how difficult it would be, how challenging it would be to be a diplomat for Taiwan. And then I came to America, English being my second language. I just knew I couldn't possibly go down a liberal arts or social science path to be a qualified later to serve in the State Department. So I took the easy way, like many first-generation Asian immigrants would do, and that is we went into math and science and engineering as a means to an end. So I felt very lucky that as much as I was seduced into fundraising or stumbled into development, that I actually found a niche where I get to combine sort of my first aspiration and something kind of practical. And I guess I was very lucky. When I first started back in the mid-1990s, most major universities that were doing this kind of work really only had one person. So I was the first number 2 in international fundraising at Cornell, then at Harvard, then at Stanford. So I kind of cut my teeth this way. And interestingly, up until the time I went to Chicago, essentially all my bosses only have worked in one institution. So they had the vertical, they didn't have the horizontal. And by the time I finished in 2010 at Chicago, I've had 4 major universities under my belt. And that really made me very unique and unusual in terms of the breadth of experiences and the depth of knowledge for this particular profession. And I think that's eventually what really made me a more successful person in doing what we do. I never walked around actively promote the fact that I'm AAPI. It's not something I think about a lot, but the older I get, the more I feel like I have a responsibility to people that are coming after us, right, to the next generations. And I'm much more conscious about the need there. And I think I was lucky in many instances, in many of the previous jobs, people just treated me fairly. Like one of, the colleagues, Jennifer will probably find this very ironic. The hardest time I had actually was back in Hawaii, believe it or not. And I think that's actually a whole other story for another time. So I'll just leave it.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for actually at least 2 nuggets that we could address in another session sometime. So thank you for that. You also, you didn't skirt over it, but an important characteristic of all this is you've been working on international fundraising in a big way for a long time. There are very few people who have had that kind of, not just the breadth that you described, but also this commitment to that transnational work that that I so admire you for.
Thank you.
It's, but it does provide an additional lens on the relationship between our work here and the rest of the world. And it's funny, you talked about how many of these people were all of them were all vertical. But one thing you didn't mention, and maybe it's just my perception, it may be incorrect, is that those programs often were they would grow and then they would they weren't sustained. There were people like yourself and Steve Suda and others, but a lot of those programs kind of grew and then they seem to focus on one country at a time or one president's interest at a time. In the same way that people were fascinated with, well, you know what, like Jennifer said, you're Chinese, therefore you should go and talk to Chinese people, which seems very mercurial. But in fact, philanthropy, I know that we're not talking international today, but philanthropy in Asia has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I know we don't all carry that with us in the work we do every single day, but it's certainly an important backdrop to this discussion that's often, like the rest of this, overlooked.
Well, and Jay, I'm glad you brought that up because that is something I talk about a lot when I speak at case conferences. So again, unlike some of our colleagues here, I'm not an AFP person. I'm a case person, a Council for Advancement and Support of Education, and I chaired a number of their international fundraising conferences before I spoke at major gift conferences in the past as well. One thing I always said is, I think what people meant is that Asians writ large in general don't practice philanthropy the American way. And I think you have to almost say, Western philanthropy has its own unique characteristics. It's not the only way to do philanthropy. And in fact, a lot of how Americans practice their charitable giving is highly influenced by legislation, by the way Congress incentivize people to give, right? And many other countries haven't quite caught up, or in fact, they did the reverse. Like in Taiwan, for example, if you give to a national university, you get more tax break than if you give to a private university, which is kind of ass backward if you ask me, right? So what I've been trying to say in my conferences at the very least is that doing good, being charitable, to me, it's a human nature. But it is, for many people, a learned behavior. And I would say because I grew up Catholic, but I didn't grow up going to masses regularly. It took me a while to remember, oh yeah, when you go to church, you make offerings, right? And some people tithe in their religious practices. And if you're coming from that kind of a background, then it's a given. But for many of us, we have to learn about it later. And I went to Cornell on a scholarship. So ultimately, I have to look back and say, who made this possible? And then it dawned on me that it's now my turn. It becomes my responsibility to give back, to make it possible for the future generations. If we travel throughout Asia, whether it's in Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, even mainland China, right? Lots of places are named after donors, hospitals, orphanages, libraries, temples, especially. My favorite example is you go to you go to Kyoto, Japan, you go to the Fushimi Inari Taisha, one of my favorite temples, and you see this kilometers and after kilometers of these red torii, these red arches. What are they? They're all donor recognitions. And it's not for nothing, right? People didn't just put this up because it's aesthetically pleasing. No, they gave lots of money to support the temple, the shrine in this case. And this is, a symbol of their philanthropy. And so different cultures, different people, we all practice doing good things, helping others. I think hopefully when people say, oh, Asians don't do philanthropy, all they're saying is they don't do it the way we do in America. And I see part of my job is to educate the donors abroad so that they can be considering their philanthropic endeavors in an American context, because I represent an American institution, whether it's Harvard, Stanford, or Phillips Exeter Academy, right? Those are the institutions that writes my paychecks. So, I have a duty to represent them and practice their kind of philanthropy. So,
thank you for all of that, Tom. And it looks like Terry may have disappeared. She may be returning. I'm not sure if that was her internet or if she had to go. But maybe a kind of a wrap-up question. We've lived through a lot in the last few years, much of which we don't really discuss unless people feel like they have the space to do it, like you were doing, Jeff, with your family, or you were doing, Jennifer, with your own experience. Not all of it negative, but certainly some of it. And I wonder, as we look forward, hopefully having learned from not only the totality of your experience in the field, plus your personal experience, if there's some kind of lesson that we can instill or share with the rising generation, hopefully a larger group of people who will continue to have the same kind of impact, the same way you were talking about, Tom, to find a way to make sure that not only do they not feel invisible, but they are able to speak authoritatively and authentically. Jeff, do you want to help?
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed listening to Tom and his work. Also, I worked in the humanitarian sector with the world's largest NGO for 16 and a half years and built 7 philanthropy shops in Asia, with Korea being the largest and Japan being the third, Taiwan actually second. I would say that we in the Asian American community need to understand this next generation, as the trillions of dollars are being transferred. There's a lot of latent capital, but we need to capture people's imaginations with a vision of what's possible. So I think we need to really articulate, and it's not easy, it's complex, right? But that there's diverse cultures within the Asian American community. And, most Asian families, if they're pushing their kids for education, they're going to be dual income, higher education. So there is that earning power, and that this upward trend of the socioeconomic influence. And to be able to have our next generation collectively, not individually, but collectively see the power of being an AAPI voice. I think that's going to be critical for us in this sector to provide leadership, but also facilitate this vision and allowing them to understand that an AAPI community is unique, It can be a unique voice, and it could do some unique things that's maybe not, Hispanic American or African American, but unique in itself, and that we should tap into that collective voice for the greater good of moving the AAPI community forward. Now, is it going to be easy? No. There's probably going to be a lot of challenges, but I think that the cultural competency in empowering AAPI voices is critical. So I see Tom being one in that fundraising space. Jennifer, I see you being that in the fundraising space and others. I could see you, speaking in the, I'm not that involved. So I just happen to be doing this in the humanitarian sector for a long time. And so I also recognize that there is a glass ceiling or a bamboo ceiling. So I can relate a lot of times with women who can't quite get to the top. Or when I was younger, I was very ambitious and wanted to get to the top, but I realized that I was going to be passed over for things. It's okay for me now, but allowing these young people to have intentionality and inspiring them towards this collective community of doing good for changing the world and making it a better place for AAPI people. Thanks for letting me share that.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah, I'll double tap on what Jeff said on the collective community. And it really is, it is a burden, right? To always have to speak on behalf of AAPI. But if we don't do it, who is? I had a conversation about this with a colleague of mine, an Indian woman, in fact, who felt the responsibility to speak out. And if she didn't, that we would continue to slip back down this slippery slide, and the future generation would suffer. Our generation would suffer, certainly, but the future generation would suffer even more, to the point where she actually had a nervous breakdown. And I didn't see her for quite a while. And then we just recently reconnected, and she admitted to me her mental health suffered greatly because of this additional burden to constantly speak out. And that's why we formed the API affinity group, and Terry is part of it. You saw Teresa very active in the chat. She is part of it. At AFP, we continue to have in-person and also virtual gatherings every month, because without this collective community that Jeff mentioned, we continue to suffer in silence, and we can't do that anymore. It was highlighted, and I alluded to this earlier, the genesis, the origin story for the API affinity group was one of our very own, right? One of our most, well-known active social media fundraisers. He calls himself the nonprofit unicorn. His name is Vu Le. He is also in Washington State, and he was dragged through the mud for a comment he made about DAFs, and how DAFs, are a fundraising vehicle that is very controversial for grassroots fundraisers. So his name was dragged through the mud, and many of us as Asians wanted to come to and jump in on this this online craziness, but many of us feared for our own jobs, because once you put yourself out there, you become a target as well. That's the additional burden. Now, Tom, I love how unapologetic you are. Like, I want to have the bravery that Tom has every day in the work and in the showing up and the presence, but I'm still working on that. I'm still working on that. And my API affinity group, these conversations continue to give me the skills, the soft skills that I need to learn how to survive. And then many times, like Tom, you said, right, the organizations that we work for are a certain way, and that's still our employer, right? That's still our employer. It's my choice to be employed by an organization such as this, or I can leave, or I can learn the skills so that I can show up in other ways to be strong for my daughter, lay the foundation for other up and coming fundraisers, lay the foundation for the next generation, like you said, Jeff. But I do feel like there's still a lot of work. Like, let's just be honest about that, right? There's still so much work to be done in this area. Continuing to have these conversations is a choice that I make, and I will do, and I will continue to do, because they're important and they will move the needle forward. The data needs to be documented. Jay, you opened us up with the fact that there's a lack of data. Let's continue to ask for our organizations to document how many fundraisers there are that are Asian, how many fundraisers of color, how many fundraisers of color are female, how many fundraisers that are doing the work of philanthropy in Asia. Document this. And Gabrielle also dropped in the chat, you know, the challenge of how do you even document this so that our own employers care, right? I was asked by my own boss to pen a statement about Stop Asian Hate on someone else's behalf. That's my voice. That's my voice. My voice matters, right? We have to make sure that our employers and our organizations care. And if we continue to just be silent about it, then it's not going to happen. So in the meantime, I'm going to take tips from Tom. I'm going to even, like, maybe I'm going to make myself a little sign, be like Tom. Be like Tom. And Jeff, I know I'm a parent just like you. I have a little girl and a little boy, and I feel like I do this work because the future matters.
Wow. Well, I would say I'm going to have a plaque that says, be like Jeff, Tom, Terry, and Jennifer. It's going to be a long plaque, but I can do it. I can make that sacrifice. Thank you all so much for doing this. I really do appreciate it. I know this recording will be meaningful to all those we share it with also, and I hope it's the beginning of a lot of conversations that document and demonstrate the work that you all have done and continue to do, and inspire others to do as well. I really do appreciate you. I also want to thank those who are here with us live, those who watch this later, and encourage you to share it with people in your offices. That we don't want to have people asking people to write letters for somebody else just because of their ethnicity. We don't want to be in a position where the next time there's a pandemic, because that isn't the last one, folks. We may or may not live to see the next one, but we don't want people beating up on people because of prejudice that's just been contained under a glass until that moment when that glass is lifted because of the fear in our communities. There's a lot to be proud of, not just among what these folks do, but what our organizations do, in part because of the community that makes it possible, and all of those in the broader, enormous majority community of folks from Asia to the United States who give at higher levels and in more profound ways, not only that they're given credit for, but probably more than any other community. So my thanks to, again, all these folks and to all of you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. We have 2 more sessions coming up next week, still from Asia on different themes, but we'll look forward to seeing you there. So until then, take care. Thank you all very much.